Does anybody else just feel like games are getting worse? Now, a quick look at the catalogue of games released this year and the ones that are still coming will tell you that as a fact that is not exactly true. Yet, the feeling remains unshakable, which got me thinking, perhaps it's not that games are getting worse, perhaps they're getting less rememberable. I mean, apart from a few games, I can barely recollect many instances of all these new releases, despite knowing that they were all excellent titles. Meanwhile, games like frickin' Soma, Papers, Please, and the Season 1 of The Walking Dead Telltale, of all things, still live rent-free in my head many years on. Now, it could be due to the sheer quantity of recent releases, the rising costs, higher expectations, or my brain just getting older and smoother. All of these reasons play a part, but there is one trend that I noticed and one forsaken adage that may answer it all. I think simply put, games are getting bigger and worse, and I used to dislike this saying so much, but less is often more. Now, I'm not saying less games, hell no, we are spoilt with choice and that is overall a good thing. The problem appears somewhere between the rising expectations of gamers and our developers constantly feeling that they need to push the envelope. Of course, we live in a world where we perceive bigger is better. So it's really no surprise that when developers envision pushing the envelope, they think of just making things bigger. A larger playable area, more characters, more secrets, more pixels to look at, more collectibles to gather. And whilst that does cause us to spend more time on the game, it doesn't really help us to remember it that well, other than forcing connections by bludgeoning us over the head with its girthy playtime. To call it back to the good old less is more saying, despite all these huge titles popping out this year, the one that I remember the most, and got me thinking of all this in the first place, is an indie game named Killer Frequency. No spoilers here, I recommend playing it, but I will set the basic plot just to help us along. Based in a small town, you play as a late-night radio host. All good and well until you receive a call from the town's only 911 operator telling you that the sheriff is dead, there's a killer on the loose, and they need to flee to the neighboring town to get everyone help. This makes you the temporary 911 call line tonight, and causes you to become all but stuck in your studio, in which 95% of the game takes place. Despite barely ever leaving this room, the game simply utilizes a large paper map of the town to give you a scale, and then allows you glimpses at the misty back alleyways to paint a vivid picture in your head of what it's like outside the safety of your studio. They furthermore do a masterful job of making the world feel lived in when all the townsfolk call in to report that they're being stalked by the killer, often giving you a location so you can correlate on the paper map to get a sense of how far away this knife-wielding Michael Myers motherfucker is from you at any given moment. This really makes whenever you need to leave the room a massive deal, even if it is just heading down the hallway of your building. Your play space feels large because the game has set the stakes and invested you into its world. It almost channels that monumentally large feeling of when you're an anxious wreck and you need to leave your room. Every single small task feels huge. And it achieves this feeling of being massive despite barely ever leaving one room. And interestingly, they did this by flipping the script on the whole show don't tell formula. Whereas a lot of our newer games are opting just to show and tell us an overloading amount of things, Killer Frequency decides to show us just enough, and then use the potential murder victims to tell us the rest, which got my brain vividly imagining scenarios. And thus, both invested and engaged with the game for its measly 5.5-hour runtime. And just because I can, now I think it's a good time to use this video as an excuse to talk about Elden Ring. Because this video is ultimately about games becoming forgettable, I just wanted to say that Elden Ring is not that. It's a great example of scaling up an existing formula and doing it well, despite the open nature of it all making it harder for nerds like me to follow along with narrative speculation. It kept me engaged with sheer content alone. I couldn't stop thinking about how good things like Big Daddy Chadfree are, and how I got viciously stomped out by a rotting malnourished redhead for 3 days straight. But what I both remember now and the things that excite me more are actually the things that we were told about but never saw in the lore, along with questions like where is Miquella? What the fuck happened to Godwyn? What's up with the gaps in the lore such as the Dragon Wars, and why are bits of Farum Azula around Stormveil Keep? Anyway, to rein myself back in from the FromSoft fanboy rants, what I'm saying is, simply not seeing everything is very powerful because it creates intrigue in its speculation. That sense of wonder and simply not knowing is hard to forget. Often, newer games rely far too much on showing us their huge fancy worlds and expending insane resources on it that they forget to focus on the core experience of their game. Sometimes they just don't tell their story properly, or the story is simply simply just lost amongst the cracks of this pressure to be bigger when they don't need to be. There are worst case scenarios though, like when a game has focused far too much on trying to do a lot that it simply buckles under its own weight. Look at Forspoken, it has cool things in there between the combat and the traversal, but ultimately all of it completely falls flat because they don't really give you a reason to care. Sure, there's a world there, but it's turned into a daunting task due to its complete lack of evoking any feeling, other than contempt with its continual assault of average dialogue and world building. Why would I want to explore more? This mistake is further made in newer releases like Atlas Fallen, which has some solid mechanics, looks great and plays really nicely, but it just has nothing going for it outside of that. The mechanics of the game just simply don't have enough gas to justify it all, because what we ultimately remember and value is the stories and the emotions that they evoke, a factor that is made much easier when the game is allowed to focus on that rather than their scale. Whilst I'm personally getting incredibly sick of open worlds and making it sound like scale is the only issue, which is just not true, but it is a contributing factor. As you make things larger, it just makes it harder to tell what you need to. As you build up a house, it needs a stronger foundation, but due to the emphasis on just being bigger, in these cases, it's often overlooked. A solid fundamental care for the world is the difference between games like WoW and New World. Now, New World has a lot going for it, but it just doesn't have the foundation that World of Warcraft has. None of the characters are worth committing to memory, even if you tried. The factions are bland and they have nothing really in their identity department that you'd actually care about, and the world suffers as a result. It's just forgettable and feels empty, even though it shouldn't. Whereas if you've spent any time playing World of Warcraft in the earlier days, you just don't forget it. The factions are distinct, the faces that lead them have a lot to them, their motivations are clear, their alliances and hatred can be felt, and it inspires players to embody their factions and their place on Azeroth, and thus enabling them to truly care about their character and what's happening in the game. Actually, 20 years on, I still remember this random fucking orc in the middle of the Barrens who asks me to find his lost wife. Like, what the shit? I even still remember his name, and I'm sorry about your wife, man, Crick. Anyway, enough about scale. Let's rein it back to less is more. It seems like developers might actually be noticing this trend as well. Just recently, Amnesia, the bunker, went with a far tighter approach. Deciding to go with a single location, an underground World War II bunker, it made the game feel much more intense. The single bunker felt huge, and the game really returned to form in a way. Hell, even Assassin's Creed this year is allegedly 5 times smaller than its last entry, Valhalla. In their own words, this one promises to be more intimate. Perhaps they're learning that whilst they can go bigger, it doesn't mean that we'll care more. One person dies, it's a tragedy. Thousands die, and it's a statistic. Grim, I know, but often we care about smaller, more intimate details. Games like Killer Frequency opt out of the need to be huge, instead opting to focus their core story and their characters, while letting us fill in the blanks around it. Games like Papers, Please take place inside a single booth, but you can feel the pressure of your mistakes on scale, because you simply know you're being watched by a ruthless political state, and they'll hurt your family. Even though you'll never see your family, you don't really need to. It still feels like the world's in your hand and your brain will do the rest. And now I want to talk about The Walking Dead Telltale Season 1 and how just one well-written relationship and the story that revolves around it still has me shook 11 years later.
Hey, Sweet Pea.
And that's purely due to the feelings that it evoked. God damn it, Lee. And whilst we're at it, Soma still has me haunted to this day, and is a great example of how relatively simple gameplay can be carried even years later by writing a truly chilling psychological horror at its base. So many horror games these days tend towards making a horror circus with a story stapled on, whereas Soma used its story as an excuse to make a game, evoking that pure fear of the unknown and what it means to be human. Compare that with Outlast 2. Yeah, there was a village and some fat priest. That's all I remember. Where complexity fails, simplicity more frequently succeeds. Funnily enough, that quote is from the next game that I want to touch on, as even some of the best games this year kinda have a problem. Remnant 2 is excellent, don't get me wrong, but the one bit I'm checking out on is the grandiose Save the World storyline. I am sick of saving worlds at this point. Despite its entire lack of environmental storytelling, I'm finding myself constantly sucked into the writings found around the realms you transverse. I don't care about the main story that much, but I do care a lot about the mystery behind this single asylum and the small haunting details of a voyage to flee a sickly homeland I found written in a journal. Why? Well, simple. They evoke emotions from me. Saving the world feels too hopeless and too large to care about. The smaller scaled stories rooted in their locations are keeping me on the hook, and are the things that I remember amongst my constant bombardment of Molotovs and shotgun shots. I feel like this is barely a script and more of a flow of consciousness at this point, but it's really enabled me to see a problem that I didn't before. Games are getting bigger to their own detriment. I mean, let's think about one of the best days you've ever experienced in your life. No matter how hard you think about it, you will never remember it all. But you will remember something someone said, perhaps a smile or a fleeting sunset. The little things really shine when you don't drown it out with the big picture. But sadly, it feels like big parts of games are being drowned out by this even bigger pressure to make waves as more and more titles come out year upon year. It feels like developers are forsaking what makes games great and what makes them unforgettable by almost diluting their core entirely into a lake of unimportant fluff when they could have just stuck to the pond.